The soldiers had already bound his wrists by the time Mercy turned onto Mulberry Street, and for one breathless moment, she believed she was watching something that belonged to another woman's life, a scene from a broadside, perhaps, or one of those grim parables the Reverend Whitmore favored about men whose pride outran their judgment. But the man on his knees before the Colvin print shop wore her husband's apron, and his fingers were darkened with the same walnut ink she had scrubbed from her own table that morning, and the distance between mercy and catastrophe collapsed with every step. A militiaman read from a folded paper, "Silas Colvin, by order of the Committee of Safety, you are charged with printing and distributing intelligence in service of the British Crown." She was past the militiaman's arm before the words had fully reached her, already between the officer and her husband, her skirts catching on the press that someone had dragged halfway through the doorway. "That is a lie," she said, and her voice surprised her. How level it was, how certain, as though certainty were a thing she could simply decide upon. "My husband prints for the Congress. Every man on this street knows this." The captain, younger than Silas, with the stiff bearing of a man who had learned authority from a manual rather than from life, regarded her, without unkindness, but without hesitation. "The evidence was found in this shop, Mrs. Colvin. Correspondence. British military instruction. Your husband will answer to the committee." Silas looked at her then, not with fear, with something older and more familiar. A warning, quiet as a hand pressed to a closing door. He shook his head, the way he always did on those nights. The press ran past midnight, and she came downstairs to find the shutters sealed, and the room thick with the smell of fresh ink and secrets. "Don't ask. Don't follow. Don't make yourself part of what I carry." She had obeyed that look for 3 years of marriage. She had built an entire wifely discipline around it. The careful art of knowing when not to know, of hearing the press run in the dark and telling herself that trust and ignorance were, for a woman in her position, very nearly the same thing. "You have until morning," the captain said. "Everything in this shop is now evidence of the Commonwealth." They marched him toward the jail on Walnut Street. Mercy stood in the doorway and watched until his coat vanished behind a hay cart, and she realized she had held her breath so long that her ribs ached with it. She did not weep. Weeping required privacy, and privacy was the first thing a public accusation destroyed. She had learned that from her father, how to stand in the center of your own ruin and wear your face like something locked. Across the street, Mrs. Firth drew her daughter inside, without a backward glance. The butcher's boy stopped his sweeping and stared with the frank, hungry curiosity of a child watching something burn. By evening, every household on this block would have the story. By morning, the name Colvin would carry the taste of treason from Market Street to the river. Nathaniel Marsh arrived before the hour had passed. He came on foot, coatless in the July heat, with the unhurried certainty of a man accustomed to entering rooms where trouble had already settled. He spoke a few quiet words to the remaining militiamen, and when he stepped inside the shop, the soldier did not follow. "I've arranged for you to keep the night," he said. "You won't be disturbed." Mercy stood behind the counter, palms flat against the same wood where she had spent 3 years tallying orders, stamping receipts, performing the small, invisible labor that held a household upright. Her hands would not stop trembling. She pressed harder, as though the grain of the oak might absorb the shaking if she gave it enough weight. "They say he printed for the British. I know what they say." His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who sat on the Committee of Safety and understood how accusations traveled, how they entered a room as whispers and left it as verdicts. I intend to see that he receives a proper hearing. He stepped closer. Not too close. Nathaniel had always understood the geometry of nearness. How close was comfort, and how close was something else, and where precisely the border fell between them. She remembered it from the months before her marriage, when he had stood in her parlor with his hat in his hands, and his future laid open in his voice, and she had chosen instead the quieter man with ink-stained fingers, who smelled of linseed oil and honest labor, and never once asked her to admire him. "I gave you my word once," Nathaniel said. "It still holds." She did not answer, but she did not ask him to leave. When he finally stepped into the darkening street with a promise to return at first light, Mercy bolted the door and leaned her forehead against the frame and breathed in the scent of the shop. Ink and oil and damp paper. The smell of a life Silas had loved more fluently than he had ever learned to love her. She did not sleep. She moved through the shop by candlelight, opening drawers the soldiers had already emptied, trailing her fingers along shelves they had already stripped bare. She was not looking for what they had found. She was looking for what they had not known to imagine. Silas was meticulous, in the way of tradesmen who understood that a single misaligned letter could ruin an entire page. That precision was not a virtue, but a condition of survival. If he had hidden something worth hiding, it would not rest where careless hands could reach. The press stood in the center of the room, with its drawers pulled wide, and its type trays scattered across the floor, like the debris of a small, violent argument. Mercy knelt beside it. She ran her fingers along the base, tracing the path she had watched Silas follow 100 times when he thought she had already gone upstairs, his hands moving with the unconscious tenderness of a man touching something he trusted more than speech. Her nail caught a seam. A panel, fitted flush with the floorboards, invisible unless you already knew it was there. She worked it loose with a composing stick, her breath shallow, the candlelight jumping against the wall. Inside, a single folded sheet, dense with handwriting. Names, dates, locations, roads and wharves and tavern names she recognized. The penmanship was not Silas's. She knew her husband's hand the way she knew his breathing. Blunt, upright, steady as a driven nail. This script was something else entirely. Fluid and deliberate, shaped by education rather than trade. The writing of a man who had been taught by a tutor, and not by necessity. She held the page close to the flame. Water had bled across the lower edge, dissolving the final entries into soft brown ghosts she could not recover. But the names she could read were Philadelphia names. Men who sat on councils. Men who spoke from platforms about liberty. Men whose reputations stood on the very ground this document seemed designed to split open beneath them. She did not yet understand what she held, but she understood this. Someone had hidden it beneath her husband's press, and someone had sent the soldiers before Silas could carry it into the light. The candle guttered, the list trembled against her fingers, and outside, Philadelphia slept on, not knowing that the most dangerous document in the city now rested in the hands of a printer's wife, alone, on her knees, with no one left to trust. Dawn came gray through the shop window, and Mercy had not moved from the floor beside the press. The list lay folded in her lap. She had read it 3 times, the legible names, the blurred ones, the locations scratched in that careful tutored hand, and each reading had changed nothing about the words on the page, but everything about their weight. She sat with her back against the press, and her knees drawn up beneath her skirts, and she let her mind do what it had been refusing to do since the soldiers marched Silas down Mulberry Street. She let it go back. Their courtship, if the word could bear that much strain, had lasted 11 days. Silas Colvin came to her uncle's house on Arch Street in the autumn of 1773, hat in hand, ink beneath his nails, and spoke to her uncle rather than to her. He was looking for a wife. He said so with the same plainness he might have used to announce he needed a new supply of linen rag or a better grade of lampblack. He was a printer. He owned his own shop. He was not a man given to conversation, but he was steady, and he did not drink, and he attended meeting every first day without fail. Her uncle, who had been housing Mercy since her father's disgrace, and was growing increasingly transparent in his desire to be relieved of the obligation, accepted on her behalf before the tea had cooled. Mercy had not objected. She had no grounds for objection and, more pressingly, no alternative that did not end in either continued dependence or a slow, genteel disappearance. Her father, Josiah Pennock, had been a chandler on 2nd Street, a decent man with unfortunate convictions, which was the most generous thing anyone could bring themselves to say. He had refused to sign the Continental Association. He had spoken against the boycott of British goods from his own shop counter, loudly and often enough that eventually the Committee of Inspection sent men to his door. After that, the neighbors stopped buying. The orders went elsewhere. The candles sat unsold in their wooden crates, like pale, abandoned fingers pointing at nothing. He died in the winter of 1774, in a rented room above a livery on Callowhill Street, and the only people at his burial were Mercy and a minister who had not bothered to learn his name. She carried that death the way one carries a stone sewn into the lining of a dress, invisible to the eye, constant against the body, impossible to set down without undressing entirely. The name Pennock had become a kind of currency in Philadelphia, traded in whispers, loyalist, crown lover, traitor's kin. When Silas Colvin offered her his name, Mercy understood precisely what she was purchasing. Not love, not even companionship, but distance, a clean ledger, a life that smelled of printer's ink instead of tallow and shame. What she had not purchased, and what no amount of wifehood could earn, was the approval of Silas's mother. The widow Agnes Colvin was a woman who believed that character traveled in the blood the way color traveled in dye. Once set, it did not wash out. She had taken Mercy's hands on the wedding day and said, "We are glad to have you, child," in a tone careful enough to pass for warmth, but precise enough to mean, "We are watching." In 3 years, that tone had never shifted. Agnes inspected the household accounts with the eye of a woman who had once run the shop herself, and treated Mercy with a courtesy so perfectly measured it was indistinguishable from suspicion. She never spoke of Josiah Pennock directly. She did not need to. Her silence on the subject had its own eloquence. And Silas, to his credit, had never asked Mercy to pretend that their arrangement was more than it was. He gave her the counter and the ledger books. He gave her a cushion for the shop chair and meat at the table 3 nights a week, and a bed she did not have to share with anyone's pity. What he did not give her was the press. The press was his country, and the work that happened after dark, the pamphlets, the broadsides, the sheets that dried on wooden racks behind the curtain and vanished before morning, belonged to a part of his life where she had never been granted passage. He locked the back room when he worked. He burned his proof sheets. He answered her questions about the late-night visitors with the same 3 words, "Shop business, Mercy," delivered in a voice so level It did not even have the decency to sound like a lie. She had told herself this was bearable. A marriage built on silence was not ideal, but it was survivable, which was more than many women could claim, and more than a loyalist's daughter had any right to expect. And for 3 years this had almost been true. Almost. Except on those nights when the press ran below, and she lay awake, counting the rhythm of the platen against paper, and wondering what it would feel like to be trusted by the man she slept beside. It was Nathaniel Marsh who had once shown her what that trust might look like, and that was the cruelest part. He had come to her first, before Silas, before the uncle's house, before her father's ruin was even fully accomplished. Nathaniel had walked into the Pennock Chandlery on 2nd Street to place an order for warehouse candles, and he had stayed to talk about trade, about the worsening quarrel with Parliament, about the way Philadelphia was fracturing, along lines no map could show. He was not yet seated on any committee, but he already carried the ambition of a man who understood that influence could be built the way a mason builds a wall, one carefully placed reputation stone at a time. He was handsome in the way that mattered most in colonial parlors, not dazzling, but reassuring, with steady eyes and a voice that made you feel your thoughts were worth hearing. Mercy had leaned toward him the way a flower leans toward whatever window offers light, not out of passion, but out of a longing so old she could barely name it, the longing to be seen, to have someone look at her face and find something there besides obligation. But her father's disgrace deepened, and Nathaniel's visits slowed, not stopped, but slowed, with the calibration of a man who was learning what proximity to a loyalist's daughter would cost. By the time Silas appeared with his blunt proposal and his unblemished name, Nathaniel had not called in 6 weeks. Mercy chose the man who offered safety. She told herself that was wisdom. She told herself the ache she felt when Nathaniel returned as a family friend, cordial, warm, always standing at precisely the right distance, was something that would fade the way a bruise fades, leaving only a faint discoloration that no one notices unless they already know where to look. It had not faded. The light through the window had shifted from gray to pale gold by the time Mercy unfolded the list again. She forced herself to read carefully now, not with the panicked scanning of the night before, but with the slow, methodical attention of a woman who had spent 3 years catching errors in columns of figures that Silas never noticed, because he believed numbers were beneath a man who worked with words. The names were arranged in no order she could recognize, not alphabetical, not geographical, not ranked by any visible hierarchy. They were simply listed, as though set down as they were discovered. Beside each name, a date, a sum in pounds sterling, and sometimes a location, taverns, wharves, a church on Germantown Road. Then she reached a name she knew. Elias Stroud. Her fingers stopped. Stroud had been a merchant on Front Street, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, a man who seemed assembled from the best qualities of Philadelphia itself. She had seen him at the meeting house a dozen times. He died 3 weeks ago, officially of fever, but the whispers had been different, quieter, more frightened. Stroud had been a courier, people said, a man who carried messages between the city and the army encampments, and someone had given him up. His name sat on this page beside a date, a sum, £40, and the words, Germantown Road, Eastern Ford. Mercy stared at the entry until her eyes burned. If Stroud had been a Patriot courier, and his name appeared on this list alongside payments in British sterling, then the document was not what she had first imagined, not a roster of traitors, assembled by the Patriot side, It was something far worse. A ledger kept by the other side, a record of men who had been purchased, or compromised, or sold. British intelligence, hidden beneath the press of a man who printed for the Continental Congress. Someone had placed it there, and someone had made certain the soldiers came before Silas could carry it into the light, not to recover the list, but to bury the man who might have exposed it. Morning traffic had begun outside. Cartwheels on cobblestone, a woman calling the price of milk. Mercy folded the list along its worn creases and slid it into the pocket sewn inside her petticoat, the one meant for household money that Silas never thought to ask about. The paper settled warm against her thigh. She stood. Her knees ached from the long night on the floor, and her hands smelled of ink from the press. And somewhere in this city, the person who had hidden the list was waiting to learn if it had been found, or if it had died with Silas Colvin's name. She intended to disappoint them. The jail on Walnut Street smelled of damp straw, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. It was a smell that clung to the throat long after you left, the kind of scent that marked the boundary between men who still owned their lives and men who had become the property of the Commonwealth. Mercy followed the turnkey down a corridor, where the sunlight struggled to reach the floor. When they stopped at the iron-grated door, she expected to see her husband diminished. A man taken from his work, stripped of his tools, locked in a cage. Surely such a man would shrink. But Silas was standing when she arrived, his hands gripping the bars. His face was bruised along the cheekbone, a dark, swelling purple that spoke of a struggle on the street, but his eyes were entirely clear. They lacked the usual guardedness, the careful shutters he kept drawn between his thoughts and her presence. "They gave you the night," he said. It wasn't a question, he had already calculated the probabilities. "Nathaniel spoke for me," she said, keeping her voice low. Something flickered in Silas's jaw, a tightening, barely perceptible, before it smoothed away. Nathaniel Marsh has a habit of speaking when it suits him. He moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Did they tear the shop apart? They took the type trays, the recent prints, the ledgers from the desk. She paused, feeling the weight of the list folded against her thigh, hidden beneath layers of linen. They missed the compartment under the press. Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Relief, profound and heavy, washed over his features, followed instantly by a terrifying clarity. When he opened his eyes, they fixed on hers with an intensity he had never shown her in their own bed. "Listen to me, Mercy," he said, his fingers tightening on the iron. "I did not print whatever they claim I printed. I found that paper yesterday morning. It was hidden inside a delivery of blank stock, bound up in the center of a ream of crown paper. I knew what it was the moment I read it. A ledger of spies, blood money." He drew a breath that sounded like a rasp on dry wood. "I put it under the press. I was going to take it to the committee at nightfall, but they came at noon. They knew it was there, Mercy. Someone knew it was there because someone put it there." Mercy felt the coldness of the stone floor creeping up through her soles. "To frame you. To silence me," Silas corrected grimly. "If I am hanged as a traitor, anything I might have found becomes the possession of a condemned man. It loses its teeth." He leaned closer, until his breath stirred the loose hair at her temple. "You must look at the shop ledger. The old one. The one I keep in the bottom drawer of the chest, not the desk. Find out who sent that delivery of crown paper. The man who sent the paper is the man who hid the list." The turnkey rattled a ring of keys against the wall a dozen yards away. Time was up. "Do not trust the committee, Mercy," Silas said, stepping back into the gloom of the cell. "Do not trust the men who speak loudest of liberty. Find the name in the ledger." She did not go straight to the shop. She walked toward the river, needing the wind off the water to clear the damp smell of the jail from her lungs. But before she reached the docks, a figure detached itself from the shadow of Christ Church. It was Widow Agnes Colvin. She wore black, as she always did since her husband's death, a color she wore like armor rather than mourning. She did not greet Mercy. She merely stepped into her path, a solid block of righteous grievance. "I have just come from the market," Agnes said, her voice carrying the flat, declarative tone of a judge delivering sentence. "Mrs. Higgins refused to sell me flour. The butcher turned his back when I approached. My son is in a cell, and the name I gave him is being dragged through the gutters." "Silas is innocent, Mother Colvin," Mercy said, holding herself rigid. "Innocence is a luxury for those whose blood is clean," Agnes replied, her gaze fixing on Mercy with cold precision. "He was a respected man before he brought you into that house. I told him then, and I tell you now, the taint does not wash out. Your father refused the association. He died a Tory sympathizer, despised by right-thinking men. That is the blood in your veins, Mercy. My father's choices were his own. They have nothing to do with Silas." "Don't they?" Agnes stepped closer, bringing with her the scent of lavender and old wool. "A printer's wife, whose father loved the king. It is a convenient narrative for the committee, is it not? They will look at you, and they will see Josiah Pennock's daughter, and they will hang my son for the treason he caught from your shadow." The cruelty of it was not in the words themselves, but in the fact that they echoed Mercy's own deepest, unvoiced terror. "Go home," Agnes commanded. "Close the shop. Keep your head down. Do not ask questions. Do not draw their eyes to you any more than you already have. If you fight them, they will only see your father." She turned and walked away, her black skirts sweeping the cobblestones, leaving Mercy standing in the shadow of the church, shivering in the July heat. The need for an ally drove her not to the shop, but to a house on Chestnut Street. Nathaniel Marsh's residence was everything the Colvin print shop was not. Spacious, quiet, smelling of beeswax and imported tea, rather than ink and sweat. The servant who answered the door recognized her, and ushered her immediately into Nathaniel's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and heavy mahogany furniture. Nathaniel rose from behind a massive desk as she entered. He looked tired, the lines around his mouth deeper than she remembered, but his eyes warmed instantly when he saw her. "Mercy," he said, coming around the desk. He did not offer his hand, adhering to that careful geometry he always maintained, but the concern in his voice was a physical weight in the room. "I told you I would come to the shop. I needed to see you," she said, the words spilling out before she could temper them. "I saw Silas. They are going to hold a hearing, Nathaniel. They have documents they claim he printed." "I know." Nathaniel sighed, gesturing for her to sit in a wingback chair. He leaned against the edge of his desk, looking down at her. "The committee is moving quickly, too quickly in my opinion, but the fervor for finding spies is high. The Congress is debating independence. They see shadows in every corner. Silas is not a spy. He was framed." Nathaniel tilted his head, his expression shifting from sympathy to something sharper, more analytical. "Framed? By whom? And for what purpose?" "Someone hid evidence in his shop, to silence him." She stopped herself, remembering Silas's warning. Do not trust the committee. Nathaniel was on the committee. But this was Nathaniel, the man who had spoken for her, the man who had promised to protect her. Did Silas say what this evidence was? Nathaniel asked, his voice very soft, very controlled. No, Mercy lied, the word tasting like copper on her tongue. Did he leave anything behind? A ledger? A document? Anything the soldiers might have missed in their haste? The questions were too specific. They lacked the vague, comforting shape of generic concern. They felt like fingers probing a wound, searching for a pulse. Mercy looked at the man who had once stood in her father's parlor and offered her the illusion of being seen. He was still handsome. He was still powerful. But the air in the study suddenly felt very thin, as though the heavy books were breathing it all in. The soldiers took everything, she said, smoothing her skirts to hide the trembling of her hands. The shop is bare. Nathaniel watched her for a long moment. It was impossible to read what lay behind his steady gaze. Then he nodded. I will secure a hearing for him tomorrow. I will speak on his behalf. Mercy, you have my word. Thank you, she whispered, and rose to leave, feeling the weight of the hidden list against her leg, burning like a brand. The shop was stifling when she returned, the afternoon sun baking the brick walls. She locked the door behind her, pulled the shades tight, and went straight to the chest beneath the stairs. The bottom drawer stuck, swollen with the humidity. She yanked it hard, the wood protesting with a loud screech. Inside, beneath old aprons and dull cutting knives, lay a ledger bound in cracked brown leather. Silas kept the shop accounts in the fine, marble-papered books on the desk. This ledger was older, rougher, used for tracking supplies and raw materials. The unglamorous bones of the printing trade. She carried it to the window, letting a single sliver of light fall across the pages. She turned them back, searching the entries for the past week. July 1st, ink from L. Harding. July 2nd, type delivery, long primer, Caslon. And then, on the morning of July 4th, the day before Silas was arrested, July 4th, 10 reams, crown paper, finest quality. Her finger traced the line across the page, to the column listing the supplier. The ink was black and unforgiving. Delivered by Marsh and Sons Warehouse. Mercy closed the book. The sound was flat and final in the empty shop. Nathaniel Marsh had sent the paper. Nathaniel Marsh had asked her what Silas found. Nathaniel Marsh sat on the committee that would decide her husband's life. She remembered his promise, spoken with such reassuring gravity, I will protect you. For the first time, she understood it was not a vow of safety, it was a threat. The hearing took place in the long, high-ceilinged chamber of the State House, a room built for men to speak of law and liberty, though on this morning it felt entirely designed to suffocate. Mercy sat in the gallery, her hands gripped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. Below her, Silas stood before the committee. He had been given a clean shirt, but the dark, spreading bruise on his face remained a testament to the Commonwealth's hospitality. Nathaniel Marsh sat among the committee members, his expression a mask of grave, impartial concern. He had promised to speak for Silas. He kept that promise. He rose, his voice commanding the room with its effortless resonance, and spoke of Silas Colvin's long service to the Congress, his quiet reliability, the unlikelihood of a printer with such deep roots in the patriot cause, turning his coat for British coin. It was a masterful performance. It sounded exactly like the defense of a man one already believed to be guilty. Then, the chairman leaned forward. Your defense of Mr. Colvin does you credit, Mr. Marsh. But how do you answer the evidence retrieved this morning from a courier captured near Trenton? The chairman held up a sheet of paper. Even from the gallery, Mercy could see the familiar weight of the parchment. A letter, the chairman announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. Written in Silas Colvin's hand, addressed to General Howe's intelligence officers, offering to print royal proclamations in Philadelphia, and detailing the locations of militia armories. It bears his signature. Silas stared at the paper, his jaw muscles clenching. I wrote no such letter. The hand has been verified by 3 men who have done business with your shop, the chairman countered. It is a forgery, Silas said, but his voice lacked the practiced volume of the politicians surrounding him. It was a tradesman's voice, flat and unadorned, and in that grand room, it sounded only like desperation. Mercy watched Nathaniel. He was looking at the forged letter with an expression of profound sorrow. He did not object. He did not point out that any skilled penman could study a printer's ledgers and mimic his hand. He simply sat down, looking like a man who had done his best and been defeated by tragic truth. The committee voted unanimously to hold Silas Colvin without bail for formal trial. Treason against the Commonwealth. The penalty was death. The ruin of a family does not happen all at once. It happens in a sequence of small, brutal closures. When Mercy returned to Mulberry Street, the first closure was waiting for her on the front door of the shop. Someone had taken a brush and a pot of tar and painted a single word across the wood: traitor. The black letters dripped onto the cobblestones like sluggish blood. She tried to wipe it away with a rag, but the tar smeared, staining her hands, staining the wood deeper. Mrs. Firth, the neighbor who usually brought a basket of bread on baking days, crossed the street to avoid her. The baker's boy spat into the gutter as he passed. The isolation was physical, an invisible ring drawn around the shop that no one would cross. The final closure came that evening, on the steps of the meeting house. Mercy had gone to seek the minister, hoping for some intervention, some character witness. Instead, she found widow Agnes Colvin standing on the steps, surrounded by the elder women of the congregation. When Agnes saw Mercy approaching, she did not step aside. She raised her voice, ensuring it carried across the square. "You will not enter," Agnes said. Mercy stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Mother Colvin." "I am no mother to you," the older woman cut her off, her voice cracking like a whip. "I warned my son against the Pennock blood. I warned him that a loyalist's daughter would bring a curse into his house. Now he sits in a cell, waiting for the hangman, and his name is painted in tar on the street. Silas is innocent. Someone has forged. Do not speak his name." Agnes's face twisted, the carefully maintained facade of tolerance completely shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at Mercy. "You brought this upon him. Your father's shame, your tainted blood. You are no Colvin. You have no family here. Leave this place, and take your curse with you." The other women watched, silent, forming a wall behind Agnes. Mercy looked at them, searching for a single face that held pity. She found none. She turned and walked away, the tar still staining her hands, realizing with a cold, terrifying clarity that she had nowhere to go. Nathaniel Marsh found her sitting on a bench near the docks as the sun began to set, watching the dark water of the Delaware River slide past. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He simply sat beside her, allowing the silence to stretch until the tight, hard knot in her chest began to loosen just a fraction. "The shop is no longer safe for you," he said quietly. "There are men talking in the taverns. They are angry, Mercy. They are looking for someone to punish, and Silas is behind bars." "Agnes disowned me," Mercy said, her voice sounding thin, like dry paper, before the whole congregation. Nathaniel turned his head to look at her. In the fading light, his face was unreadable, but his presence was a heavy, anchoring weight. "I am sorry, truly. I spoke for him today. But the letter was forged." "Perhaps," Nathaniel said softly, "but the committee believes it. You cannot change that tonight. What you can do is survive." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, before coming to rest lightly over hers. His palm was warm. "Come to my house. You cannot stay at the shop. I have spare rooms. You will be safe there until we decide what to do." It was a dangerous offer. A married woman staying in the home of a bachelor, even a respected one, invited scandal. But scandal belonged to a world where she still had a reputation to lose. She was the daughter of a loyalist, the wife of a condemned traitor, disowned and shunned. She looked at Nathaniel's hand covering hers. She remembered the ledger entry, delivered by Marsh and Sons. She needed to know what he was hiding. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Nathaniel." His household was quiet, orderly, and entirely suffocating. He gave her a room on the second floor, a tray of food she could not eat, and a quiet, lingering look before he closed the door that spoke of a dozen things left unsaid. For an hour, Mercy sat on the edge of the feather bed, feeling the bizarre, terrifying comfort of the house. It would be so easy to let him protect her, so easy to pretend the ledger entry meant nothing, that Silas was simply a victim of tragic circumstance, and that Nathaniel was exactly what he appeared to be, a harbor in a storm. But Silas's bruised face hovered in her mind, and the memory of the cold jail floor anchored her to the truth. Near midnight, the house was entirely silent. Mercy opened her door. The hallway was dark, but a faint glow spilled from the crack beneath Nathaniel's study door at the far end of the hall. She moved silently, her stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. She stopped just outside his door. The wood was solid mahogany, but she could hear the faint crackle of a fire. In July, she knelt, pressing her eye to the large brass keyhole. Nathaniel stood by the hearth. He was not wearing his coat. In his hand he held a folded document. He stared at it for a long moment, his face illuminated by the flames. Not the face of a confident committee man, but something drawn, exhausted, and deeply burdened. He tossed the paper onto the fire. As it caught, curling inward, the flames illuminated the back of the sheet. Pressed into the paper was a heavy dollop of red sealing wax. Even as it began to melt, Mercy could clearly see the impression stamped into it. A crown over a fouled anchor. The seal of the British Admiralty. Nathaniel watched it burn until it was nothing but ash, then turned away. Mercy scrambled back to her room before he opened the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She locked her bedroom door. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely untie the laces of her stays. She reached into her hidden pocket and pulled out the treason list. She laid it flat on the small writing desk, placing the candle close. The dampness that had blurred the bottom edge of the paper had finally dried out in the warm, dry air of Nathaniel's house. The ink, previously a smeared ghost, had settled back into the fibers of the paper, faint but readable. Mercy leaned close, her breath catching in her throat as she traced the final line. A date, a sum of money, £200, a staggering amount, a location, the Blue Anchor Tavern. And beside it, written in that elegant, tutored hand, the name of the man who had just offered her shelter. Nathaniel Marsh. The vice closed. She was not in a harbor. She was locked inside the house of the man who had sold her husband's life to buy his own. To be a guest in the house of the man who is murdering your husband requires a specific kind of madness. It requires you to sit across from him at the breakfast table, to watch him butter his bread, to listen to the steady, reassuring cadence of his voice, and to not pick up the silver knife lying by your plate and drive it into his throat. Mercy managed this madness by retreating to the deepest, coldest part of herself, the place where Josiah Pennock's daughter had learned to survive the hatred of an entire city. For 3 days, she lived inside a performance. She played the ruined woman, frightened and dependent. She let Nathaniel see her tears, knowing they were real enough, though he did not understand their source. And Nathaniel played his part as well. He was the harbor. He was the steady hand. The most devastating realization was not that he was a monster, but that he wasn't. He was gentle with her. On her second evening in his house, when the heat broke in a violent thunderstorm, she found him standing by the window in the parlor. He turned as she entered, and the flash of lightning illuminated a face weary to the bone. "My father hated storms," he said quietly, offering her a chair near the hearth, though no fire burned. "He always believed the roof would cave in." "And you?" Mercy asked, her voice carefully modulated. "I learned early that waiting for the roof to fall is worse than standing in the rain." He looked at her, his eyes dark and earnest. "I want you to be safe, Mercy. Whatever happens with Silas, you will not be abandoned. You must believe that." The tragedy of it caught in her chest like a barbed hook. He meant it. He had sold Silas to the British to protect his own skin, but he genuinely wanted to save her. He wanted to build his salvation out of the wreckage he had created. He wanted to be the hero of the disaster he had engineered. "I believe you," she said, lowering her eyes so he would not see the revulsion in them. On the morning of the 4th day, the committee called an emergency session. General Washington's army was moving, and Philadelphia hummed with a frantic, paranoid energy. Nathaniel left the house before 7, his coat brushed, his expression locked into the severe mask of a patriot. The moment the front door closed, Mercy went to his study. The room was meticulously kept, smelling of lemon oil and old paper. She stood before the heavy mahogany desk, listening to the quiet of the house. The servants were in the kitchen. She had perhaps an hour. She bypassed the obvious places, the ledger books stacked openly, the letters sitting on the blotter. A man who hid his treason behind the badge of a committee member would not leave his secrets where a casual glance might find them. She thought of Silas's press, the seamless panel hidden in plain sight. She began to search the desk, running her hands along the underside of the drawers, checking the depth of the shelves against the exterior dimensions. Nothing. She checked the bookshelves, pulling out the heavy volumes of law and philosophy, searching for hollowed spaces. Nothing. Panic, hot and sour, began to rise in her throat. She looked at the fireplace, where she had seen him burn the document with the British seal. She knelt on the hearth, her hands smudged with soot, feeling along the brickwork. A loose brick, 3 courses up on the right side. She pulled it free. Behind it was a cavity, small and dark. She reached inside and pulled out a leather satchel. She carried it to the desk and opened it. The first thing she found was a brass stamp, a heavy, cold thing that bore the exact impression she had seen melting in the fire. the crown over the fouled anchor. Beneath the stamp lay a bundle of letters. She untied the ribbon. The letters were not written in English. They were strings of numbers and seemingly random letters, a cipher. She couldn't read them, but their existence alongside the seal was damning. But it was the final document at the bottom of the satchel that stopped her breath. It was a piece of familiar crown paper, the same high-quality stock Silas used. It was covered in handwriting, but not the elegant script of the treason list. It was an awkward, stuttering attempt to mimic the blunt, upright hand of Silas Colvin. It was a practice sheet. I write to offer my services to the crown. Written once, crossed out. I write to offer my press to the crown. Written again. The loops on the P and the S carefully adjusted to match Silas's style. Nathaniel hadn't just planted the list to frame Silas. When that wasn't enough to secure a conviction quickly, he had forged the letter himself, sitting in this very room, practicing her husband's handwriting until he had perfected the lie that would hang him. Mercy stared at the sheet, the ink seeming to blur and sharpen in her vision. The meticulous cruelty of it was staggering. He had stolen Silas's life with the very tools Silas loved, ink and paper. She folded the practice sheet, took 3 of the ciphered letters and the brass seal, and slipped them into her pocket, alongside the treason list. She replaced the satchel in the cavity, sliding the brick back into place, taking care to smear the soot so it looked undisturbed. She needed an ally, not a powerful man, not a politician. She needed someone who understood the weight of paper. Tom Hadley smelled of cheap ale and stale tobacco. He was 19, a printer's apprentice, who had worked for Silas until the arrest scattered the shop's labor. Mercy found him in a tavern near the wharves, nursing a tankard and staring at the table. When he saw her, he started to stand, a mix of guilt and defensive anger crossing his face. "Mrs. Colvin, I couldn't stay at the shop, not with the soldiers there." "Sit down, Tom," she said, sliding onto the bench opposite him. She didn't have time for apologies. "You know Silas is innocent." Tom looked away, his jaw tight. "I know it. But knowing it, don't stop the committee from hanging him." "I have proof," she said. His eyes snapped back to hers. "Proof?" She kept her hands folded on the table, her voice pitched low beneath the din of the tavern. "I know who framed him. I have the evidence. But I cannot present it alone. I am a woman. And worse, I am Josiah Pennock's daughter. If I stand before the committee, they will see only a loyalist trying to save her traitor husband." Tom swallowed hard. "What do you need me to do?" "I need a witness who is clean. An apprentice who can testify to the delivery of the paper, and who can carry the documents I give him." She leaned closer. "The man who framed Silas is Nathaniel Marsh." Tom's face went pale. "Marsh? He's on the committee. He is a spy," Mercy interrupted, the word sharp as glass. "And he is going to let Silas hang to cover his own tracks." She outlined the plan quickly. She would present the forged practice sheet and the treason list. Tom would bring the ciphered letters and the brass seal, entering the room only after Nathaniel had committed himself to Silas's guilt. "They meet tomorrow at noon," Mercy said. "Will you do it, Tom? Will you speak for him?" Tom looked at the scarred wood of the table for a long time. Then he nodded. Silas was a good master. He didn't deserve this. "No," Mercy said. "He didn't." The sun was sinking, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky. By the time Mercy returned to Chestnut Street, she let herself in, expecting the quiet emptiness of the afternoon. Instead, she saw the light spilling from the open door of the study. Nathaniel had returned early. Mercy stopped in the hallway, her heart seizing. She forced herself to breathe, to arrange her features into the mask of the frightened, dependent woman. She stepped into the doorway. Nathaniel was standing by the fireplace. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the hearth. He had not removed his coat. His posture was rigid, the tension in his shoulders visible, even from the door. "Nathaniel?" she said softly. He didn't move for a long second. Then, slowly, he turned his head. The warmth that usually softened his features when he looked at her was completely gone. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying calculation. He looked from her face down to the hearth, to the brick she had removed, and back up to her eyes. "Have you been in this room, Mercy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The air in the room felt suddenly too thick to breathe. The evidence dragged at her pocket, heavy as lead. "No," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I went for a walk near the river." The house was stifling. He watched her face. He was looking for the lie. He had spent his life studying the faces of men he was betraying, and men who were betraying him. He knew the micro-expressions of guilt, the subtle shifts of fear. Mercy gave him none of them. She stood perfectly still, offering him the face she had perfected over 3 years of a silent marriage, a face that gave absolutely nothing away. Nathaniel's expression did not change, but his eyes did. Something shifted in them, a dark, cold acknowledgement. He knew. "I see," he said softly. He finally turned fully toward her, stepping away from the hearth. "You should rest, Mercy. Tomorrow will be a difficult day." "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady, even as the blood roared in her ears. "It will." She turned and walked up the stairs, knowing with absolute certainty that she had not deceived him. The game of shadows was over. By tomorrow noon, one of them would be destroyed. Part 6. Before the committee. The chamber of the Committee of Safety was crowded, smelling of damp wool, pipe smoke, and the sour sweat of men who had spent the morning discussing war. Mercy stood at the back of the room, her presence barely registered among the milling politicians and clerks. She was invisible, the natural state of a printer's wife, the assumed condition of a woman without a male protector. She watched the chairman take his seat at the long oak table at the front of the room. She watched the other members settle into their chairs, and she watched Nathaniel Marsh. He looked perfectly at ease, engaged in low conversation with a man from the provincial assembly. He wore a coat of dark blue broadcloth, his hair neatly queued, his posture radiating the calm authority of a man who owned not just property, but the respect of his peers. He did not look toward the back of the room. He did not need to. He knew she was there. The chairman struck his gavel, the sharp crack silencing the room. "We are convened," he announced, "to hear further evidence in the matter of Silas Colvin, printer, accused of treasonous correspondence with the enemy." Mercy stepped forward. Her skirts rustled against the floorboards, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. Heads turned. Frowns appeared, irritation quickly giving way to recognizing pity. The traitor's wife. "Mr. Chairman," she said. Her voice trembled on the first syllable, betraying her, but she forced the second to hold firm. "I have evidence concerning my husband." The chairman looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. "Mrs. Colvin, this is highly irregular. Your husband is represented by counsel. My husband is represented by the man who framed him, she said, her voice ringing clear across the wood-paneled room. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Nathaniel turned slowly. His face was a study in sorrowful patience. He looked at the chairman, giving a subtle, infinitesimal shake of his head. The poor, mad woman. Mrs. Colvin, Nathaniel said gently, stepping toward her. You are overwrought. No one blames you for your distress, but this is not the place. Do not speak to me, she said, the venom in her voice slicing through his practiced calm. She turned her back to him, facing the chairman. From her pocket, she drew the practice sheet and the treason list. She laid them on the oak table. Silas Colvin did not forge the letter that condemned him, Mercy said, her hand resting flat on the paper. This is the draft of that forgery. You can see the practice strokes, the attempts to mimic his hand, and this, she touched the second paper, is a list of names. Paid informants for the British Crown. This list was hidden in my husband's shop, inside a delivery of crown paper. The chairman picked up the practice sheet, his brow furrowing as he studied it. He reached for the list. Nathaniel did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, sliding a leather folio onto the table beside her papers. Mr. Chairman, Nathaniel said, his tone heavy with regret. I had hoped to spare this woman further humiliation. I had hoped to handle this matter quietly, for the sake of the affection I once held for her family. But since she insists on public spectacle, I must insist on public truth. He opened the folio. Mrs. Colvin speaks of forged letters, Nathaniel continued, his voice resonating with tragic authority. But she is no stranger to treasonous correspondence. Inside this folio are letters written by Josiah Pennock, Mercy Colvin's father. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Mercy felt a coldness start at the base of her neck and spread downward. Josiah Pennock, Nathaniel said, ensuring every man in the room heard the name, was a vocal, unrepentant loyalist. He cursed this Congress. He prayed for the king's armies to crush our militias. These letters, written to his Tory associates before his death, prove it beyond doubt. He looked at Mercy, and for a moment, the mask slipped. His eyes held a terrifying, intimate cruelty. He was using the very thing she had confessed to him, the wound she had exposed to him in the quiet of his parlor. Is it so difficult to believe, Nathaniel asked the room, that the daughter of a loyalist, married to a man facing the gallows, would fabricate evidence to save him, to cast blame on a loyal patriot? Her blood is tainted with Tory sympathies, gentlemen. She is her father's daughter. The room erupted. Men were shouting. The chairman was banging his gavel. Mercy stood frozen. The nightmare had caught her. The shame she had spent her marriage trying to outrun had finally run her down. Here, in the center of the city, dragged into the light by the man she had almost loved. Your father's blood runs in your veins, Agnes Colvin had said. She had been right. It didn't matter what Mercy said or did. They would only ever see the loyalist's daughter. She looked at the men around the table. They were looking at her not with anger, but with disgust. The judgment was already formed. She had lost. Silas was dead, and she had killed him. Nathaniel stepped close to her, under the cover of the shouting room. His shoulder brushed hers. I told you I would protect you, he said, his voice pitched so low only she could hear it. It wasn't a taunt. The horror of it was that it sounded like genuine grief. You should have let me. He had chosen survival. He had chosen it over Silas. and now he was choosing it over her. He was sorry, perhaps, but he was not going to burn. The chairman's gavel finally cracked hard enough to splinter the silence back into place. "Mrs. Colvin," the chairman said, his face stern, "these are grave accusations against a respected member of this committee, made by a woman whose family history is troubled. Unless you have corroborating witness to these claims, I must ask you to leave." Mercy opened her mouth, but the words were ash in her throat. She had no witness. Tom Hadley had not come. He was a boy, easily frightened, and she had asked him to stand against powerful men. He had run. She looked at the papers on the table. The ink seemed to mock her. "I have a witness." The voice came from the back of the room. It was not Tom Hadley's voice. It was deeper, rougher. Every head turned. Silas Colvin stood in the doorway. He was flanked by 2 militiamen, but he was not bound. His face was still bruised, his shirt still stained, but he stood with a rigid, furious dignity that made the politicians at the table look suddenly small. Beside him stood Tom Hadley. The boy was trembling, his face pale, but he held a thick leather ledger clutched to his chest. "Mr. Colvin," the chairman said, recovering his shock, "you are remanded to the jail. What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Mr. Chairman," Silas said, walking down the center aisle, "is that I demanded to face my accuser." He stopped beside Mercy. He didn't look at Nathaniel. He looked at his wife. He saw the devastation on her face, the way she was shaking, and he did something he had never done in public in 3 years of marriage. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, stained with ink, and holding on to her like she was the only solid thing in the room. "Tom," Silas said, without turning around. The apprentice stepped forward. He placed the ledger on the oak table, right on top of Josiah Pennock's letters. He opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. "This is the delivery manifest from Marsh & Sons warehouse," Silas said, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Dated July 4th. Signed by Nathaniel Marsh." Nathaniel's face finally lost its color. The mask cracked, revealing the panicked man beneath. "It details the delivery of 10 reams of crown paper to my shop," Silas continued. "The same paper that contained the list of British spies. The same paper my wife just presented to you." Mercy found her voice. She pulled the ciphered letters and the heavy brass seal from her pocket and dropped them onto the table. They landed with a heavy, final clatter. "I found these in a hidden cavity in Mr. Marsh's study," she said, her voice no longer trembling. "Along with the practice sheet. He is the spy. He framed my husband to cover his own treason." The room was absolutely silent. The evidence sat on the table. The manifest, the practice sheet, the seal, the ciphered letters, the list, a chain of paper and ink, linking Nathaniel Marsh to the gallows he had built for another man. The chairman looked at the pile, then slowly raised his eyes to Nathaniel. "Mr. Marsh," the chairman said, and the deference was completely gone from his voice. It was replaced by the cold, hard tone of a judge. "How do you answer?" Nathaniel looked at the table. He looked at Silas, and finally, he looked at Mercy. There were no more lies to tell. The survival he had fought so ruthlessly for had just collapsed into ash. He stood in the center of the room, a ruined man, and for the first time since Mercy had known him, he had nothing left to say. The chamber of the Committee of Safety was crowded, smelling of damp wool, pipe smoke, and the sour sweat of men who had spent the morning discussing war. Mercy stood at the back of the room, Her presence barely registered among the milling politicians and clerks. She was invisible. The natural state of a printer's wife. The assumed condition of a woman without a male protector. She watched the chairman take his seat at the long oak table at the front of the room. She watched the other members settle into their chairs. And she watched Nathaniel Marsh. He looked perfectly at ease, engaged in low conversation with a man from the provincial assembly. He wore a coat of dark blue broadcloth, his hair neatly queued, his posture radiating the calm authority of a man who owned not just property, but the respect of his peers. He did not look toward the back of the room. He did not need to. He knew she was there. The chairman struck his gavel, the sharp crack silencing the room. "We are convened," he announced, "to hear further evidence in the matter of Silas Colvin, printer, accused of treasonous correspondence with the enemy." Mercy stepped forward. Her skirts rustled against the floorboards, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. Heads turned, frowns appeared, irritation quickly giving way to recognizing pity. The traitor's wife. "Mr. Chairman," she said. Her voice trembled on the first syllable, betraying her, but she forced the second to hold firm. "I have evidence concerning my husband." The chairman looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. "Mrs. Colvin, this is highly irregular. Your husband is represented by counsel." "My husband is represented by the man who framed him," she said, her voice ringing clear across the wood-paneled room. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Nathaniel turned slowly. His face was a study in sorrowful patience. He looked at the chairman, giving a subtle, infinitesimal shake of his head. The poor, mad woman. "Mrs. Colvin," Nathaniel said gently, stepping toward her. "You are overwrought. No one blames you for your distress, but this is not the place." "Do not speak to me," she said, the venom in her voice slicing through his practiced calm. She turned her back to him, facing the chairman. From her pocket, she drew the practice sheet and the treason list. She laid them on the oak table. "Silas Colvin did not forge the letter that condemned him," Mercy said, her hand resting flat on the paper. "This is the draft of that forgery. You can see the practice strokes, the attempts to mimic his hand, and this," she touched the second paper, "is a list of names. Paid informants for the British Crown. This list was hidden in my husband's shop, inside a delivery of Crown paper." The chairman picked up the practice sheet, his brow furrowing as he studied it. He reached for the list. Nathaniel did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, sliding a leather folio onto the table beside her papers. "Mr. Chairman," Nathaniel said, his tone heavy with regret. "I had hoped to spare this woman further humiliation. I had hoped to handle this matter quietly, for the sake of the affection I once held for her family. But since she insists on public spectacle, I must insist on public truth." He opened the folio. "Mrs. Colvin speaks of forged letters," Nathaniel continued, his voice resonating with tragic authority. "But she is no stranger to treasonous correspondence. Inside this folio are letters written by Josiah Pennock, Mercy Colvin's father." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Mercy felt a coldness start at the base of her neck and spread downward. "Josiah Pennock," Nathaniel said, ensuring every man in the room heard the name, was a vocal, unrepentant loyalist. He cursed this Congress. He prayed for the king's armies to crush our militias. These letters, written to his Tory associates before his death, prove it beyond doubt. He looked at Mercy, and for a moment, the mask slipped. His eyes held a terrifying, intimate cruelty. He was using the very thing she had confessed to him, the wound she had exposed to him in the quiet of his parlor. "Is it so difficult to believe," Nathaniel asked the room, "that the daughter of a loyalist, married to a man facing the gallows, would fabricate evidence to save him, to cast blame on a loyal patriot? Her blood is tainted with Tory sympathies. Gentlemen, she is her father's daughter." The room erupted. Men were shouting. The chairman was banging his gavel. Mercy stood frozen. The nightmare had caught her. The shame she had spent her marriage trying to outrun had finally run her down, here, in the center of the city, dragged into the light by the man she had almost loved. "Your father's blood runs in your veins," Agnes Colvin had said. She had been right. It didn't matter what Mercy said or did. They would only ever see the loyalist's daughter. She looked at the men around the table. They were looking at her, not with anger, but with disgust. The judgment was already formed. She had lost. Silas was dead, and she had killed him. Nathaniel stepped close to her, under the cover of the shouting room. His shoulder brushed hers. "I told you I would protect you," he said, his voice pitched so low only she could hear it. It wasn't a taunt. The horror of it was that it sounded like genuine grief. "You should have let me." He had chosen survival. He had chosen it over Silas. And now, he was choosing it over her. He was sorry, perhaps, but he was not going to burn. The chairman's gavel finally cracked hard enough to splinter the silence back into place. "Mrs. Colvin," the chairman said, his face stern, "these are grave accusations against a respected member of this committee, made by a woman whose family history is troubled. Unless you have corroborating witness to these claims, I must ask you to leave." Mercy opened her mouth, but the words were ash in her throat. She had no witness. Tom Hadley had not come. He was a boy, easily frightened, and she had asked him to stand against powerful men. He had run. She looked at the papers on the table. The ink seemed to mock her. "I have a witness." The voice came from the back of the room. It was not Tom Hadley's voice. It was deeper, rougher. Every head turned. Silas Colvin stood in the doorway. He was flanked by 2 militiamen, but he was not bound. His face was still bruised, his shirt still stained, but he stood with a rigid, furious dignity that made the politicians at the table look suddenly small. Beside him stood Tom Hadley. The boy was trembling, his face pale, but he held a thick leather ledger clutched to his chest. "Mr. Colvin," the chairman said, recovering his shock, "you are remanded to the jail. What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Mr. Chairman," Silas said, walking down the center aisle, "is that I demanded to face my accuser." He stopped beside Mercy. He didn't look at Nathaniel. He looked at his wife. He saw the devastation on her face, the way she was shaking, and he did something he had never done in public in 3 years of marriage. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough with calluses, stained with ink, and holding on to her like she was the only solid thing in the room. "Tom," Silas said, without turning around. The apprentice stepped forward. He placed the ledger on the oak table, right on top of Josiah Pennock's letters. He opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. "This is the delivery manifest from Marsh & Sons warehouse," Silas said, his voice ringing through the chamber. "Dated July 4th, signed by Nathaniel Marsh." Nathaniel's face finally lost its color. The mask cracked, revealing the panicked man beneath. "It details the delivery of 10 reams of crown paper to my shop," Silas continued. "The same paper that contained the list of British spies. The same paper my wife just presented to you." Mercy found her voice. She pulled the ciphered letters and the heavy brass seal from her pocket and dropped them onto the table. They landed with a heavy final clatter. "I found these in a hidden cavity in Mr. Marsh's study," she said, her voice no longer trembling. "Along with the practice sheet. He is the spy. He framed my husband to cover his own treason." The room was absolutely silent. The evidence sat on the table. The manifest, the practice sheet, the seal, the ciphered letters, the list, a chain of paper and ink, linking Nathaniel Marsh to the gallows he had built for another man. The chairman looked at the pile, then slowly raised his eyes to Nathaniel. "Mr. Marsh," the chairman said, and the deference was completely gone from his voice. It was replaced by the cold, hard tone of a judge. "How do you answer?" Nathaniel looked at the table. He looked at Silas, and finally, he looked at Mercy. There were no more lies to tell. The survival he had fought so ruthlessly for had just collapsed into ash. He stood in the center of the room, a ruined man, and for the first time since Mercy had known him, he had nothing left to say. Nathaniel Marsh did not struggle when the militiamen laid hands on him. He did not shout, nor did he beg the committee for leniency. He simply surrendered to the mechanics of his own ruin, with the same quiet, unhurried grace he had used to construct it. As they led him from the chamber, he stopped in the doorway. He looked back, past the men who had once considered him a peer, past the table piled with the evidence of his treason, and found Mercy in the crowd. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look he gave her was stripped of all its former armor. The charm, the authority, the carefully calculated warmth. What remained was the bleak, hollow truth of a man who had gambled his soul for safety, only to find that safety was the one thing he could no longer afford. He lowered his head, and the guards pushed him out into the hall. The committee moved with ruthless efficiency. Silas Colvin's irons were struck off immediately. The treason list, the forged draft, the ciphered letters, and the brass seal were entered into the official record. By mid-afternoon, Nathaniel Marsh was locked in the same cell Silas had occupied that morning. Mercy and Silas left the State House together. The heat of the day had finally broken, giving way to a cool, damp breeze rolling off the Delaware River. They walked in silence, the space between them filled with the exhausted, ringing quiet that follows the end of a battle. Silas moved stiffly, his body still carrying the ache of the jail, but he did not lean on her. He walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man returning to a life he had thought was finished. They did not go straight to the shop. Their path took them past the meeting house square, where the late afternoon shadows were stretching long across the cobblestones. A figure in black stood on the lowest step. Widow Agnes Colvin did not look like a woman who had come to apologize. She stood as rigidly as ever, her face stern, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. When she saw Silas, a brief, violent tremor ran through her shoulders, but she did not rush to him. Instead, her eyes fixed on Mercy. They stopped at the base of the steps. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the words Agnes had spoken the day before, the curse she had laid upon Mercy, the public shunning, the weaponization of Josiah Pennock's shame. Agnes looked at Mercy, studying her face, as though trying to reconcile the woman standing before her with the loyalist's daughter she had so thoroughly despised. Then, slowly, Agnes unclasped her hands. She reached out. She did not speak. She did not ask for forgiveness, and Mercy did not offer it. Forgiveness was too simple a word for the wreckage between them. But Agnes took Mercy's hand in her own, her grip surprisingly strong, her skin cool and papery, and squeezed it. Once, hard. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement, forged in the fire of near ruin, that the blood in Mercy's veins had saved the Colvin name when the Colvin blood had been powerless to do so. Agnes let go, turned, and walked slowly up the steps into the meeting house. Mercy and Silas continued down Mulberry Street. The familiar brick front of the print shop came into view, the word traitor, still stark and black across the door, smeared where Mercy had tried to scrub it away. Silas stopped and stared at the tar. "I will need lye and a hard brush," he said quietly. "It will take time," Mercy replied. "The wood has absorbed it. Then we will scrub until we reach clean wood." Silas turned to her. In the fading light, the bruise on his face looked darker, but his eyes were entirely unguarded. The distance he had always maintained, the careful, silent wall he had built between his work and his wife, was gone. "I shut you out," Silas said, his voice rough. "I thought I was protecting you. I believed that if you knew nothing, you could not be held to account." "Ignorance is not safety, Silas," Mercy said softly. "It is only a different kind of trap." He nodded, looking down at his ink-stained hands. "I know that now. I left you blind, and because I left you blind, you were nearly swallowed by a man who saw exactly how to use you." Mercy felt a sharp, sudden ache in her chest. The truth of Nathaniel Marsh was a wound that would take a long time to heal. "He saw me, Silas," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "For a little while, he made me feel visible, and I wanted that. I wanted it so much I almost let him destroy you." Silas looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, abiding sorrow. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry that I made you feel you had to look elsewhere to be seen. I should have seen you first." He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer grand promises of reborn love or sweeping declarations of devotion. Silas Colvin was not a man built for poetry. He was a man built for labor. "Will you help me?" he asked, gesturing to the stained door. "Yes," Mercy said. They did not embrace. They did not pretend the fractures in their marriage had vanished. But as they walked up the steps and unlocked the door, stepping together into the familiar scent of oil and paper, they were no longer two people sharing a silence. They were two people choosing to speak. The revolution did not pause for private grief. By August, the Declaration of Independence was being read in town squares across the colonies, and the Colvin press ran late into the night, printing the words that would unmake an empire. The shop smelled of fresh ink and hot wax. Outside, the city of Philadelphia hummed with the frantic, restless energy of a people learning how to govern themselves. Inside the shop, the press stood in the center of the room, strong and steady. Mercy stood before the type cases. She held the composing stick in her left hand, her right hand moving deftly over the small lead compartments, selecting the letters one by one. She did not wait for Silas to tell her what to set. She did not sit by the ledger while he worked in the dark. Her hands were stained with ink, the black marks pressing deep into the whorls of her fingertips, a stain that would not wash out. She set the letters firmly into the stick, locking them into place. She was a loyalist's daughter. She was a printer's wife. She was a woman who had broken a spy and saved a man's life. She pulled another letter from the case, feeling the cold, heavy lead between her fingers. For the first time in her life, Mercy Colvin was choosing the words herself.